No one understood why she did it. 70 years old, slow steps, steady gaze, and yet she broke into an abandoned military building like she was carrying out a mission. Some said she was just a confused old woman. Others believed it was all carefully planned. But no one dared to ask why, because there was something in the way she walked. A silence that didn't beg for help. It demanded to be heard. And when they handcuffed her, she didn't look defeated. She looked at peace. In court, she sat as if time didn't touch her. The prosecutor provoked her, but her lips never moved. Veterans whispered in disapproval, but she didn't blink. And the judge, as hard as he tried, and couldn't hide his unease, there was a haunting calm in that woman, as if she knew something no one else did, something that could turn everything upside down, and for now, was hidden in absolute silence. There were no documents in her hands, no written defense, no spoken plea, just a worn Bible and a gaze that cut through every lie. She didn't cry, didn't apologize, didn't look back. She sat in the defendant's chair not as someone accused, but as someone carrying a secret. An old secret, heavy, and full of names some would rather bury. And no matter how they tried to make her look guilty, something felt off. It was as if the real trial hadn't even started yet. Every statement from the prosecution hit a wall. Nothing shook her. Nothing seemed new to her. Even those mocking her quietly felt a strange fear. Because some pains don't scream, some truths prefer silence until the right moment. And some people, even in chains, are the only free ones in the room. The judge struck the gavel and asked the question everyone feared. Why did you do it? She just lowered her head, not to hide, but to breathe, as if she knew the answer would come, and the world would never be the same after it. Whatever she saw in that building remains unknown, but her silence, oh, that silence, echoes like a scream buried deep in the soul of someone who lost everything and decided they'll never pretend they didn't see again.
Before diving into this exciting story, we want to make sure you don't miss out on any of our incredible content. If you haven't subscribed to our channel yet, now is the perfect time to do so. By subscribing, you'll become a valued member of our growing community, where we share amazing stories, insightful lessons, and much more. Don't wait any longer. Hit that subscribe button now and join us on this amazing journey.
The sound of handcuffs echoed like a blade against the cold courtroom walls. Grace Montgomery sat upright in the witness chair, her eyes locked on Judge Daniel Harrington, unflinching, steady, like someone holding back a storm. Behind her, veterans murmured among themselves, arms crossed, judgment already written across their faces. On the screen, a silent video played. Grace kneeling on the floor of the abandoned military center, hands behind her back, calm and unmoved. Prosecutor Laura Stevenson walked toward the center of the room, her heels clicking like a metronome, narrating what she called the facts. Grace remained silent, lips sealed, as if her voice belonged to a time yet to come. The judge, robed and solemn, studied her carefully, her stillness, her defiance, her quiet. The tension pressed in. A 70-year-old woman trespassing into a military facility. Why? But there she was, unapologetic, undeterred. Judge Harrington cleared his throat, folding his hands over the open file in front of him. Mrs. Montgomery, do you understand the charges against you? His voice was firm yet lacked its usual authority. Grace didn't answer. She only looked at the flag behind him for a moment before returning her gaze to his. The air thickened. Rochelle Davis, seated behind, closed her eyes and whispered a silent prayer, feeling the weight of that moment. The judge tried again. Why did you enter a decommissioned federal installation knowing the legal consequences? Grace slowly bowed her head, not in shame, not in guilt, just silence. One of the veterans mumbled, "Disrespect? That's what it is. But Grace didn't flinch. Her body sat like a monument to something deeper. Laura paused the video. She pointed to the image of Grace kneeling in front of an improvised altar inside the abandoned center. "This is a deliberate violation," she declared, trying to stir the room. The judge listened, but his eyes never left Grace, as if her silence whispered louder than any testimony. For a beat, the room held its breath. Grace touched the small silver cross around her neck, a simple gesture but heavy with meaning. The prosecutor continued her argument, but her voice seemed to fade against Grace's silence. No one knew why she refused to speak, and that mystery was becoming more disturbing than any confession. While the prosecutor insisted on strict punishment, Grace showed no fear. Her expression changed, ever so slightly. Not defiance, expectation. The judge noticed. He tapped his fingers on the bench as if trying to summon a memory. What is she waiting for? He wondered silently. The veterans exchanged uneasy glances. The tension curled around the room like smoke. Grace shut her eyes for a heartbeat. Something was building beneath the surface. She wasn't just a trespasser, she was a mother with a buried story. The judge took a deep breath and struck the gavel. "Mrs. Montgomery, this is your final chance to speak before I proceed." His voice cracked ever so slightly. What was she hiding? Rochelle bit her lip, unsure whether to intervene. The veterans stiffened. Laura waited, poised like a predator. But Grace did nothing. Her silence screamed. Even the air seemed to pause. No one dared move. It wasn't just a courtroom. It was a waiting room for the truth. Outside, the wind picked up. The flag trembled. Church bells rang softly in the distance. The judge then made his decision. "I'm ordering an official inspection of the military center, and I'll attend personally." Murmurs erupted. Laura objected, but he waved her off. Rochelle's heart skipped. Grace flinched. Just a tremble, barely visible. But it was there. Something had struck a nerve. The judge didn't catch it. But Rochelle did. She sat very still, like she had seen a shadow pass. As the officers prepared to remove Grace from the courtroom, she finally looked up. Not in defiance. In memory. The judge held her gaze too long. Something passed between them, unspoken, unresolved. The silence was louder than a verdict. The scene faded not with words but with tension, stretched thin like storm clouds before rain. The judge turned to the clerk to finalize the record. But the entire room still watched Grace, who seemed to carry not just a secret, but a story that could undo everything they thought they knew. The makeshift cell in the courthouse basement was damp, its concrete walls stained with age and the musty scent of old wood. The hallway's weak yellow light barely reached past the bars, but just enough to reveal Grace's calm face as she sat on the narrow bench. Her fingers rested on the cross pendant around her neck, an automatic gesture like holding it kept her together. The sound of the guard's boots echoed until it faded. In the quiet, Grace closed her eyes and slipped into memory. It was morning. Sunlight filtered through the chapel window at the military center as she knelt before a worn altar, whispering prayers no one would hear. Her body trembled, but her voice was steady. She never asked for revenge. Only strength. Back in the present, the sharp clink of keys snapped her back. The guard appeared, studying her like she was a ticking clock. But Grace looked at him with something close to kindness, like a mother watching a child who didn't yet understand silence. Upstairs in the courtroom, Laura Stevenson pushed hard for a psychological evaluation. "This behavior suggests confusion, possibly instability," she argued, eager to discredit Grace's dignity. But the judge hesitated. There was something in that silence that didn't fit her theories. Something he recognized, perhaps within himself. While legal arguments raged above, Rochelle Davis reached through the cell bars and squeezed Grace's hand. No words, just pressure. Steady. comforting. Two black women, tired of being labeled dramatic or broken, shared a private alliance. Rochelle passed her a small bundle hidden beneath her blouse. Grace accepted it gently, careful not to draw attention. The guard was distracted and Rochelle slipped away. Their bond needed no speeches, just looks, just faith, the kind born from long years of carrying unseen burdens. In the courtroom gallery, the veterans grew louder. "She desecrated sacred ground," one muttered. "Disrespect," another snapped. A third, older, stayed quiet, his eyes glistening. They were raised in honor codes where speaking too much was betrayal, but silence could be too. They weren't sure if Grace was a martyr or a threat. Rochelle returned to her seat, hands trembling. The judge called for order. The voices stopped, but suspicion had already soaked through the walls. Below, the cell was quiet again. Grace sat in the shadows, holding the bundle in her lap. She unwrapped it slowly. Just a note, folded 4 times. The paper was soft at the edges. She hesitated. Something told her it carried more than ink. But before she could open it, the lock turned again. The guard returned, breathless. "Let's go. The judge wants you at the military center." She rose, slowly, but with grace. She tucked the note inside her coat sleeve. Some truths had to wait. The courthouse hall seemed longer now. Each of Grace's steps stretched time itself. Rochelle watched from afar, her chest tight with words she hadn't said. The judge avoided her eyes as she passed, but unease showed in his posture. Laura smirked, thinking she'd gained ground. But truth rarely walks in straight lines. Outside, the transport van waited. The wind tugged at the American flag above. Grace climbed in, flanked by 2 officers. The guard stood, watching unsettled. He'd noticed the tremor too. As the van turned down the road to the abandoned center, Grace leaned her head against the window and closed her eyes. The engine's hum blurred into memory. Marcus with his backpack, the pocket Bible slipping from his coat. His final call. The whispered, "I love you, Mom." Then, silence. The same silence she wore now like a second heart. The note hidden in her sleeve felt strangely warm. She didn't know its contents, but she knew one thing. Once it was opened, nothing would be the same again. The military center's gate creaked open, groaning as if resisting the presence of the living in a place long claimed by ghosts. Grace was led inside, still in handcuffs, as if she posed a threat to the echoes. Wind swept through the abandoned structures, lifting old leaves and weathered scraps of paper that danced around her feet. Beside her, retired Sergeant David Cabo D. Thompson walked with tight posture, followed by veterans whose eyes held the weight of unspoken judgment. The cracked walls seemed to watch silently. Each step echoed through the halls where boots once marched with purpose. Faded posters boasted past missions and forgotten valor. Dust hovered like history, refusing to settle. But to Grace, every breath in that space was not memory. It was reckoning. Judge Harrington entered last, his hands tucked in his coat, scanning the surroundings with a gaze that felt like it was chasing something lost. Laura Stevenson followed, clipboard in hand, more concerned with documentation than understanding. Grace walked slowly but deliberately. She paused in front of a shattered photo display showing Marines returning from deployment, smiling, tired, alive. She placed her hand on the cracked glass. Her eyes welled, but she didn't cry. One veteran muttered, "This ain't a place for tears." But she breathed and kept walking. Down the main corridor, worn tiles led to the makeshift altar where Marcus once prayed. Grace recognized it instantly. It was the only place not overtaken by mold, still smelling faintly of old wood and wax. She paused, just briefly, but the atmosphere shifted. The veterans grew restless, as if her pause disturbed something sacred. The judge watched, his breathing slowed. Her presence was pulling threads everyone had tried to bury. "Let's get this over with," Cabo D grumbled. But Grace looked up at the collapsed ceiling where sunlight pierced through, scattering dust like golden confession. All around her, display cases with dusty medals, shrunken uniforms, helmets like monuments to forgotten battles. Grace walked among them as if in a graveyard. Her fingers traced the edge of an instruction table, a slight tremble, almost invisible. The judge noticed. He said nothing. Laura whispered to a veteran, trying to pry into Grace's mental state. But Thompson interrupted. "Delusion's what the government did with his name." Silence followed, the kind that agrees without a word. Grace stopped at a large frame draped with an old cloth. She raised her hand, but a veteran stopped her. "Don't touch that." The judge stepped forward, ready to intervene, but Grace pulled back. Not yet. She understood. Every item here had an owner, a story, truth hidden under dust and denial. For some, it was a shrine. For her, maybe both. Sunlight through broken, windows painted bars across the floor. She walked between them like someone walking into a memory armed only with pain. She stopped by a shelf of photos. Her eyes searched and found him. Marcus. Young, pristine in uniform, smile restrained, but eyes ablaze. She didn't touch the frame, just looked. For a long time. Cabo D saw and muttered, "You don't have the right to speak his name." And that's when the pain flickered across Grace's face. She didn't respond, but her eyes, tired, yet unshaken, spoke louder than rage. The judge saw it, and for the first time realized he was standing in something deeper than regulation. The room thickened. Veterans went still. The prosecutor fell quiet. Slowly, the judge approached her. "Did you know him well?" he asked. Grace inhaled deeply. "He was my son." The impact was thunder without sound. No one moved. Cabo D stepped back, and the judge felt something he hadn't in years, shame. But Grace didn't lash out, didn't cry. She stood, alone, and yet whole. The lights in the military center flickered, some blinking as if struggling against decay. The group gathered in the main hall felt heavier than before, tension settling like iron dust in the air. Grace kept her gaze lowered, walking between shadows and memories while voices clashed around her. "She's unbalanced," one veteran muttered, arms crossed. "Or manipulated." Laura Stevenson paced with impatience, scribbling on her clipboard as if trying to pin down ghosts. The judge stayed back, watching everything, especially Grace, whose silence felt less like absence and more like strategy. She knew that speaking too soon could derail something much larger. It wasn't time yet. Grace approached a cracked display case, the glass dusty, the contents faded. Inside, an old Marine uniform lay folded, still dignified. She raised her hand, almost asking permission to touch the past. Before her fingers reached the glass, Cabo D blocked her. "This isn't a souvenir," he said, standing like a wall. Grace didn't speak. She took a small step back, eyes steady. The judge moved slightly but held. Laura struck. Mrs. Montgomery may be suffering from persistent delusions, especially considering her age and unresolved grief. Rochelle flinched in silence, recognizing the tactic, invalidate the woman before the truth. The veterans murmured again, but this time their whispers were more anxious than angry. Something about Grace's presence stirred old dust they'd rather leave untouched. A white woman in uniform, standing in the back, watched Grace with unease but said nothing. The judge asked for quiet and stepped toward the display. He examined the uniform as if searching for something invisible. "This will be brought to my office tomorrow morning," he said. "Officially." The room went still. A line had been drawn between burying the past and unearthing it. Grace gave a small nod, tears rising but not falling. As the officers prepared to secure the exhibit, Rochelle pulled something from her coat pocket. The note, the one Grace hadn't had time to read. Rochelle hesitated. Her hands trembled. Her eyes met Grace's for just a moment, seeking permission. But Grace looked away, trusting fate to handle its course. Rochelle folded the paper again and slipped it back into her pocket. Not yet. The truth had a sacred clock. Forcing it might wound more than heal. Time froze. Even the wind seemed to pause. The judge turned to close the visit. Laura, frustrated, protested, "This is a waste of time, Your Honor. No legal evidence, no material proof." The judge raised a hand, silencing her with a gesture. "We're dealing with something older than law," he said, voice low but heavy. One veteran cleared his throat, uneasy. Another looked away. Grace stood still, facing the uniform, knowing it held more than threads. It held testimony. Suddenly the lights flickered and went out. The room dimmed, lit only by weak beams of sunlight through broken windows. The judge called for calm. The veterans instinctively formed a loose circle, like old drills. Grace didn't move. Her reflection appeared in the broken glass. 3 versions of herself: the mother, the widow, the accused. One smiled faintly, one cried. The third simply stared, ready. Laura, trying to regain control, suggested Grace be removed immediately. The judge refused. "We'll know more tomorrow," he said firmly. The veterans left slowly, one by one, their silence stretching out the hallway. Rochelle stayed a moment longer, the note burning in her pocket, her eyes fixed on Grace's still figure. She turned away, feeling like she was leaving a spark behind, and the fire was coming. Dawn bathed the courthouse in pale gold as the hall still held the hush of early morning. In Judge Harrington's private office, the uniform lay spread across a dark wooden desk, lit by a single amber lamp. The judge studied each seam, each button, each fold like he was reading the ruins of a man's life. Grace sat silently beside him, her eyes locked on the fabric like a mother watching her child sleep. Across from them, Laura Stevenson stood with folded arms, already preparing arguments to discredit anything that emerged. Rochelle lingered at the doorway, gripping a folded note that felt heavier than paper. The veterans remained outside. The room was thick with unspoken things. The judge slipped on white gloves as though about to touch something holy. Slowly, he opened the jacket's inner pocket. From within, he pulled out a note, folded 4 times, yellowed at the edges. The room fell completely silent as he carefully unfolded the paper. His eyes, trained to read laws and verdicts, now followed lines written by a steady, emotional hand. "Your Honor, if this uniform has reached you, know that I owe you my life. Seek the truth behind the faces wearing medals in my name." Signed, M.M. The judge froze. Rochelle gasped. Laura scowled, but Grace closed her eyes, and one tear finally broke the silence. The judge placed the note gently on the table, as if afraid it would vanish. Then, with trembling hands, he turned the uniform and examined the waistband. Under the lamp's light, the thread glistened. Montgomery. A silent gunshot through the room, a name that crossed generations, debts, and destiny. Harrington stepped back, his face pale. "My God," he whispered. He gripped the back of the chair but didn't sit. Rochelle wept softly. Laura held her composure, but her mask cracked. Grace rose slowly and met the judge's eyes. "Now you understand why I entered that place." Finally, the judge sat. His hand trembled over the note, but when he spoke, his voice, though raw, was steady. "You and your son, you saved me." The only sound that followed was a distant church bell. For long seconds, no one moved. Grace stood still, unshaken. The handwriting was Marcus's. The words, undeniable. The name, indisputable. A mother doesn't lie about a dead son, and a Marine doesn't write lightly before a mission. The prosecutor finally rose, reaching for her authority. This letter could have been planted. The name could belong to another Montgomery. But no one answered, not even the judge. His gaze never left the embroidery. Rochelle stepped closer and placed her hand on Grace's shoulder. A small gesture, but one stitched from generations of grief, silence, and stubborn faith. Grace closed her eyes and whispered, "He planted a seed, and now it blooms." Harrington looked out the window. Justice arrived late. The judge stood and walked slowly to the office door. He opened it firmly. The veteran stood. In his hands, Marcus's uniform. This belonged to Marcus Montgomery, and today he speaks for all of us. Some lowered their eyes. Others looked at each other, ashamed. None spoke. Grace faced them, not with anger, but with the calm of someone who waited years for this moment. Laura had no more words. Rochelle, at Grace's side, clutched Marcus's pocket Bible tightly. His name now echoed, not as accusation but redemption. Back in the room, the judge placed the note inside the jacket's pocket again, sealing a memory. This will be entered into court records and sent to the Federal Review Board. We're reopening Fredericksburg. His voice now belonged to a man seeking redemption, not just a verdict. Grace sat again and released a single sob, quiet, but full of years. That sound filled the space in a way no sentence could. It was pain, release, grief, and triumph in one breath. The judge rubbed his face and murmured, "I never knew who he was, until now." The courtroom was full when Judge Harrington entered again, his steps slower now, his eyes searching less for control and more for truth. Prosecutor Laura Stevenson stood poised to pounce, but even she sensed the shift in the room. Rochelle sat. Near the railing, Marcus's Bible clutched between her hands like a silent shield. Grace sat once again in the defendant's seat, but this time without handcuffs. A small detail, but symbolic. The judge adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and spoke with weight. "I hereby suspend the case until further notice. A federal investigation is to begin immediately, based on the letter presented." A ripple moved through the gallery. He continued, "There is sufficient evidence to reopen this case." Laura cut in, "Your Honor, this note has no verified origin, no forensic proof." The judge didn't even lift his eyes. "This isn't about convenience. It's about honoring an old debt." The words lingered like thick smoke. The veterans exchanged glances, some proud, some ashamed. Cabo defolded his arms, his face stone, but his eyes showed cracks. The judge handed the uniform to a waiting federal officer. Justice had been awakened, but not yet delivered. This was only the beginning. Grace took a long breath. Her fingers clutched her cross necklace tightly. No smile, no gratitude, just closed eyes, and a whispered verse like a needle sewing her heart back together. "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free." John 8:32. Rochelle held back, tears. Even the judge averted his gaze, something still bleeding behind it. The crowd looked torn. Some saw a martyr, others a manipulator. But no one had more power in that moment than Grace's silence, a silence that both healed and indicted. Outside, the air was heavy but not suffocating. Rochelle met a group of Marcus's former comrades, veterans who had come without uniforms but with war behind their eyes. One of them, Malik, said, "He spoke of you, Ms. Grace, said his mom was stronger than all of us." She smiled with restrained tears. Rochelle held her hand. "You're not alone." It was what Grace feared most and needed to hear the most. She wasn't fighting alone anymore. Inside, the judge gathered papers while Laura headed toward the exit, defeated but not done. "This isn't over," she muttered. But her voice had lost conviction. For the first time, the story had slipped from her hands. The veterans stood slowly, some misty-eyed, others just quiet. None of them met Grace's gaze. In her presence, the truth they'd buried began to surface. Outside the courthouse, a crowd was forming. Locals, church members, old friends, all drawn by something bigger than legal procedure. Rochelle pulled up a chair beside Grace, who sat, beneath a tree. "Think it'll rain today?" Grace asked, watching the darkening sky. Rochelle smiled. "Maybe, but a lot's already being washed from the inside." And they laughed softly, like two women who turned pain into quiet strength. But as the sun dipped, a police vehicle slowed in front of the courthouse. A man stepped out, worn face, stubble, tired eyes. He wore a weathered marine jacket. Slowly, he climbed the steps. Rochelle noticed first. Grace looked up. It was former Corporal Elijah Price. He pulled a small notebook from his coat, bound in tape. "Your son left more than you know." The crowd quieted. Grace stood. The judge emerged from the doorway. The courtroom was more crowded than ever. Local cameras peeked through the windows, and the veterans' murmurs felt like the beginning of a moral storm. Grace sat quietly in the witness section, without her necklace, without her son's Bible, just hands folded in her lap. Judge Harrington entered without a word, took his seat, and stared toward the door. It opened. Former Corporal Elijah Price walked in, slowly, firmly, holding a worn notebook wrapped in tape. No one spoke. Rochelle stood in the back, wringing her hands. The truth was coming, and no one knew if they could handle its echo. Elijah stopped, in the center, and asked to testify. His voice was deep, deliberate, each word carrying the power to burn down old lies. "Your Honor, my name is Elijah Price. I served with Marcus Montgomery in Fredericksburg, and this is what he tried to leave behind before he died." He opened the notebook, revealing pages stained with sand, sweat, and handwritten notes, dates, codes, names. Laura Stevenson stood immediately. "Objection. This is not an official document." The judge didn't flinch. "It's a soldier's written memory, and it will be heard." The courtroom fell into a breathless stillness. The pages exposed altered orders, ignored patrols, and missing names from official reports. Marcus knew something was wrong. Supplies were vanishing. Phantom patrols were being faked for expired contracts, Elijah said. He documented everything until the day he vanished. Laura protested again, calling it speculation. But the judge silenced her with a glance. Elijah pulled out a small pocket Bible, marked with verses, with a final note inside. A folded page naming the judge, with a message. "I trust him, but he must know the truth if I don't make it back." The judge turned pale. For the first time, he leaned forward, face in his hands. Rochelle looked at Grace, still, silent, unmoved. It was as if her son filled every inch of that room. Her long-held faith now stood as testimony. Elijah went on. He believed that truth saves more lives than silence ever could. Veterans in the gallery cried softly. Some bowed their heads, others clenched fists. Laura clung to her role, but her control was cracking. Grace remembered it all as Elijah spoke. The empty phone call, the sealed casket, the hollow words from military officials. But what hurt most was the emptiness in their eyes, as if her son had become a file number. She gripped the bench, not out of rage, but because grief was finally finding a name. The judge lifted his head, voice strained. "I never understood why he looked at me that way that day. Now I do." He knew. Grace looked at him, not with anger, but with a silent plea. "Don't stop now." Laura, desperate, clutched her last thread. "Your Honor, the defendant is inciting unrest among veterans and authorities. This threatens public safety." But the judge was firm. What threatens safety is silence, and it's lasted long enough. The words rang through the chamber like a funeral bell. Rochelle wept openly. Grace remained quiet, but her breath came easier, like a new wind entering a worn heart. The judge stood. "I will summon the officials named in this notebook and in prior reports. This is no longer a local matter, it's..." National. Laura sat, defeated. The veterans rose, not for the court, but for Marcus. Elijah stepped down and handed the notebook to the judge, who took it like something still beating. He wanted the truth to leave the trenches, he said. Grace, for the first time, closed her eyes and smiled. Not with joy, but with peace, as if she heard her son come home through the sound of justice. Night had fallen quietly, cloaking the courthouse in long, creeping shadows. In the main office, only the desk lamp remained lit, casting golden light over scattered papers like ruins of a story no longer willing to stay buried. Judge Harrington was alone. His coat hung on the chair, tie loosened, eyes locked on an old military file pulled from his personal safe. Inside it, among yellowed folders, one name stood out: Marcus Montgomery. The file wasn't complete. Redacted lines, censored, dates, official stamps, but it was enough, he knew. The young man who had once saved his life in the desert was the same whose mother now sat silently in his courtroom, unwavering. Turning pages, the judge found a faded photo of a group of Marines. He himself appeared, younger, kneeling, wounded, being held up by another soldier. The face was streaked with dirt, but the eyes were unmistakable. Marcus. The report labeled the rescuer as unidentified, but it was a lie. The judge remembered the pain, the blood, and a calm voice whispering, "You'll live, I promise." He had never forgotten, but he had never dared to search for the name, maybe out of fear, maybe shame, or maybe because, deep down, he already knew. The next morning, the courtroom was once again packed. The judge entered without his robe, holding only a folder. The room fell silent. Without preamble, he stood before the court and faced Grace. "There is something I must say, not out of duty, but out of debt." Everyone straightened in their seats. Laura fidgeted with her papers, bracing for impact, but Harrington breathed in, then said, "During Operation Kandahar in 1990, I was saved by a Marine I didn't know. I never learned his name. Until now." Grace closed her eyes. The crowd held its breath. He raised the photo. "This is me. And this is Marcus Montgomery." The judge trembled. His file was archived, without honors, without truth. His act erased for convenience. A veteran whispered, "My God." Rochelle covered her mouth. Grace didn't move, but her tear-filled eyes spoke volumes. The judge looked at her. "Your son saved me, and I failed to acknowledge it." This was more than a recognition. It was a public confession, a rupture with decades of silence. Laura stood, trying to regain ground. "Your Honor, with all due respect, this can't be used as procedural evidence," but he interrupted. "This isn't an argument. It's repentance." Her posture deflated, and for the first time, she looked smaller than her title. The veterans stood, not for duty, but for Marcus. Grace remained seated, like someone who waited her whole life for the world to speak what she always knew. The judge returned to the bench. "Effective immediately, Marcus Montgomery will be formally recognized as a war hero, and the circumstances of his death will be reviewed by federal oversight." The room erupted in silent applause, too heavy for clapping. Rochelle wept openly. Elijah, seated among veterans, gave a subtle nod to Grace. She touched the cross around her neck. Her faith had never needed loud victories, just truth. As the judge moved to adjourn, he turned once more to Grace. "Forgiving isn't forgetting, and I haven't forgotten." She didn't speak. She only nodded, dignified. It was the kind of forgiveness not spoken aloud, but shared through silence. The courtroom had ceased to be a place of accusation. It was now a space of redemption. But before the judge could leave, one question lingered behind every gaze. Was there more truth still waiting in the shadows? The courtroom held a sacred silence as Judge Harrington reopened the session. No one whispered, No one moved. It was as if the room itself waited to breathe until the truth spoke. Then the doors opened. 7 of Marcus's former comrades entered. No uniforms, just simple clothes and determined steps. Leading them was Lieutenant Carla Johnson, 59, a black woman with lines of courage on her face, holding a sealed box of documents. Rochelle closed her eyes. Grace didn't move, but her gaze was sharp. This time she was ready. Carla stepped to the stand. These letters were written by Marcus Montgomery in the final 2 months of his life. He never had the chance to deliver them. He entrusted them to us. The prosecutor tried to object, but the judge allowed it. Carla opened the box, pulling out envelopes marked with dates, codes, signatures, and names. These contain accounts of embezzlement, ghost soldiers, and bribery among superior officers. Each envelope was a quiet explosion in paper. The judge read in silence. The sound of turning pages filled the room like thunder. Veterans in the audience lowered their heads. Some cried, others whispered prayers. Carla read each letter aloud, without drama, just facts. Marcus described times, places, who received, what, and how he tried to report it all before he was silenced. If I don't make it back, it's because truth costs too much, but don't let silence cost even more. Rochelle wept in quiet sobs. Grace watched, as if her son was speaking through every voice in that room, and it was stronger than any verdict. The final letter was addressed to whoever has the courage to continue. It was short, a plea. Don't let my mother die not knowing who I truly was. Grace covered her face. The tears came now, freely, clean, full, and long overdue. The judge waited. Then standing, he declared, "In light of this new evidence and the absence of any criminal intent, I hereby dismiss all charges against Grace Montgomery." A breath passed through the room like wind through open windows. No cheers, just release. Laura Stevenson remained seated, staring at her hands, beaten, with nothing left to say. The veterans rose and turned toward Grace. Some saluted, others simply nodded, eyes red. The judge added, "All names mentioned in these letters will be submitted for federal review. The deaths and disappearances tied to the Fredericksburg unit will be re-examined." It was done. The story would be retold, this time with names and blood and truth. Rochelle embraced Grace tightly. "You did it. He did it." Grace looked up at the ceiling as if searching for his voice. He always wanted the truth to come out, all of it. The people who once whispered behind her now stepped aside in quiet respect. Grace stood at the center of the room, still, breathing. Like this moment was all she ever needed to feel whole. The church bells rang outside, and, for a moment, it sounded like they rang just for her. The judge approached and handed her a blue-green envelope. "We found this at the bottom of the box." It was Marcus's journal, the one that had never reached her. Grace held it with both hands, tears rising. "Is there more?" she whispered. The judge nodded. "There is." But he didn't say, "What?" Rochelle gripped her hand. "Maybe the most important part is still in you." And maybe that was true. But Grace felt it. That journal held something more, something only she could unlock. Grace sat alone at the restored altar inside the former military center, now bathed in natural light and solemn quiet. The walls had been cleaned, the stained glass windows repaired, and a temporary plaque read, "Under renovation, Future Marcus, Montgomery Memorial." In her lap, the blue-green journal lay open. The pages held precise notes, brief reflections, and scattered Bible verses between technical entries. But what caught her attention most was a hand-drawn symbol on the back. Cover a wing entwined with a flame. Next to it, Marcus had written, "This is the seal of the rescue, the day I saved more than lives." She traced the image with her fingertips, as if touching an ancient secret. As she read the final pages, Grace discovered Marcus had written about a mission never listed in official reports. He hadn't just saved the judge, he had rescued a group of Afghan civilians hiding in a ruined village, defying direct orders. To disobey in order to obey conscience, he wrote. And below that, if I die, let it be known, it wasn't recklessness, it was faith. Grace stopped there, then smiled, the kind of smile that holds both sorrow and pride. Her son had died at peace with his choice. No one could erase that. Months later, a modest ceremony took place. The once forgotten center had been transformed into a living memory space, not of war, but of courage, integrity, and redemption. Marcus Montgomery's EO name was etched in white marble at the entrance beneath the words, "Truth is also a way of serving." Soft hymns echoed off the restored walls, and black women, mothers, veterans, and daughters, sang in chorus while flags moved gently in the breeze. Judge Harrington, present, handed a symbolic key to Grace. What once imprisoned you, now belongs to you. She accepted the key without a word, but her eyes gleamed brighter than they ever had. Rochelle and Elijah stood beside her. The veterans, once divided, now watched as witnesses to something greater than rank, the courage to speak. On the walls, the letters, the diary, the uniform, and a large replica of Marcus's symbol were displayed. Next to it, a plaque read, "To those who served and kept serving long after their final march." After the ceremony, Grace stood alone beneath the flag. She took Marcus's worn Bible from her pocket and placed it on a glass stand at the altar. "May other sons find here what my eyes took years to see," she whispered. The judge approached, but stopped a few feet away. "I never had children," he said, "but today, I feel like I fulfilled something I owed to one." Grace nodded without turning. She no longer needed anyone's approval. Her grief had become legacy. As the crowd dispersed, a young black boy, around 8, ran up to the altar and asked, "Is this place real, ma'am?" Grace knelt, placed a hand on his shoulder, and replied gently, "It's where truth lives now." The boy smiled and ran back to his parents. She watched in silence, like someone seeing the future light a candle, where once there was only shadow. The windows of the old military base now reflect the sky, no longer the shadows of the past. Where forgetfulness once lingered, now echo hymns, light footsteps, and the whispers of memory. Grace walks slowly, aged hands touching clean display, cases where her son's uniform rests as a witness to something greater than war. The name, Marcus Montgomery, now shines in gold above the entrance, no longer whispered in secret. Children from local schools visit the memorial, hearing stories once muffled by fear. Every wall bears a verse, a letter, a prayer that was never forgotten. And there, at the center of it all, an empty chair, symbol of the absence that birthed this present. It is no longer a place of pain, it is a silent altar of redeemed justice. Judge Daniel Harrington watches from afar, dark suit, hands clasped, wearing a gentler expression than ever before. He knows that many ghosts never leave, but they can be transformed into guides. Marcus's diary is now in safe hands, and the judge has vowed to make it a public document. For him, there are no more excuses, no comfortable silences. The past once saved him. Silence nearly condemned him. And one woman's courage finally set him free. That day he understood justice only begins when truth becomes stronger than fear. Rochelle Davis leads a group of black women veterans into the main hall. They sing an old hymn whose verses speak of desert crossings and promises made through tears. Grace's voice joins them, steady though weary, not as mourning, but as testimony. She sings for all the mothers who never got answers, for all the sons whose names were lost in the corridors of bureaucracy, for every woman who's been called mad, stubborn, or unstable, just for wanting to know the truth. And for every judge who once chose silence until challenged by a cross on a mother's neck, that song is more than tribute. It is a declaration that faith does not die, it waits. Grace's hands still tremble holding the diary, but now it's the tremble of life, not despair. She writes a dedication on the back cover. To those who come after, do not remain silent, even when the world tries to deny you. She closes the book, looks to the sky, and smiles. The clouds move slowly, revealing the sun, and the wind seems to whisper something only she can understand. Perhaps it was her son's voice, or perhaps it was simply peace finally arriving. At the military cemetery, a new monument stands, etched into the stone. Courage doesn't always shout. Sometimes it's the mother who stands in silence. Families of veterans gather there to pray, not only for those who fell, but for those who stood. Grace lays a white rose at the foot of the monument. The judge joins her also in silence. Their eyes meet in gratitude, and the past finally bows before the truth. When the last visitor leaves, Grace stays for a moment alone. She watches the flag gently waving atop the hill. She whispers, "May my son continue to inspire truth and faith." It's a prayer, a promise, and a legacy all at once. In the background, a group of young recruits marches past, saluting the memorial. A child holds her mother's hand and asks, "Who was he?" And the mother replies, "He was someone who refused to stay silent. And because of that, we are here."